So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nate Greenberg. I am the interim director of the AbuSulayman Center for Global Islamic Studies here at George Mason University. I am so happy to introduce this panel today. I'll say just briefly, this is our second to last event from the Global Islamic Studies Center for this semester. But I think in some ways this is the most anticipated for us. Naglaa and I were talking 5 years ago. We hosted a panel on Sudan and the uprising in 2019 as events there were just beginning. And we had Mosaab and Eltayeb and others to talk about that moment. And it was a time of great exhilaration and uncertainty. And I think none of us could have anticipated, or perhaps in some ways, but anticipated where the situation would be today. So we're going to hear a lot about what's going on in Sudan, and after the panel, I invite everybody to please stick around. We've got some food coming, and an opportunity to network with our speakers and others in the room. So this is a chance to kind of take some dedicated time this afternoon to think about Sudan and to really reflect on what's going on. So it's my honor to introduce my colleague, Dr. Naglaa Hussein. Naglaa has been leading the Arabic program here for the last several years and doing an incredible job, in particular renovating our curriculum, and did the nearly impossible task of creating a new core curriculum seminar that focuses on Black and minority cultural productions in the Middle East. This panel today is also a kind of recognition of that accomplishment. So it's my pleasure to introduce Naglaa, and she will introduce the speakers. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Nate, for the introduction. Do you hear me? Yeah. I am Naglaa Hussein, term associate professor of Arabic language here at George Mason. So, as an affiliate to the AbuSulayman Center for Islamic Studies and a member of the Arabic Studies program here at George Mason, it's my honor to welcome our guest speakers today. Mosaab and from Giza and Dr. Nisrin Elamin from the University of Toronto, and our very own Eltayeb from the Sudanese Student Association here at George Mason. Before I delve into the great work of our panelists today, I would like to express how long overdue this panel is. So is more local and international community response to the civil war crisis now in Sudan. Thank you for the center, the AbuSulayman Center for Islamic Studies at GMU for organizing this panel. Really, thank you, appreciate it, and breaking in the international silence and marginalization surrounding our beloved Sudan. In 2019, we eagerly followed the Sudanese taking it to the streets. We enjoyed the young Sudanese chanting in the streets, Thawra, Thawra, and we prayed for the success of the Sudanese revolution. All eyes were on Sudan at the time, hoping that they would not fall under yet another military rule, and they would learn from the mistakes of their neighbors, the Egyptians. The Egyptians took a deep breath and breathed hope that finally civil ruling and stability were coming all the way to Sudan. From December 2018 through April 2019, thousands of Sudanese took it to the street and forced Omar al-Bashir, a dictator of 30 years, to step down. A transitional military council of his allies took over and agreed to share governance and hand over the power to a civilian ruling. But the road to democracy is not always paved with flowers. It's not always easy. In April 2023, just last year, a civil war broke out between two military powers. General Hameti, leader of the RSF, which is the Rapid Support Forces, Quwat al-Da'am al-Sari'a, and General al-Burhan, leader of the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, leading the country into the worst humanitarian crisis of all ages. Over 8.6 million Sudanese have been displaced, with many fleeing to neighboring countries, and there has been a mass death and use of sexual violence. It is so heartbreaking to know that one of the continent's most prosperous nations is now a war zone. As I always encourage my students, some of them are here, that in my class about Afro-Arab literature, to read the literature of the Afro-Arabs as a literature of resilience, of agency, and a literature of great contributions to the world's greatest civilization. Sudan is one African nation with a rich cultural heritage, a diverse group of languages and ethnicities. Sudan is a true example of what Professor Ali Masrouri said about African triple heritage: the indigenous, the Arab Islamic, and the colonial European. Today's speakers will help us understand what happened, what went wrong, and perhaps give us a clue on how we might be part of bringing peace to Sudan. Our guest speakers are Dr. Nisrin Elamin, who is Assistant Professor of Anthropology and African Studies at the University of Toronto. She's currently writing a book tentatively titled Stratified Enclosures, Land, Capital, and Empire Making in Central Sudan, which focuses on Saudi and Emirati land grabs and community resistance to land dispossession in the Gezira region of Sudan. In addition to scholarly articles, Nisrin has also published and written several op-eds for Al Jazeera, the Washington Post, OK Africa, Hammer and Hope, and the Cultural Anthropology Hotspot series. Before pursuing her PhD, Nisrin spent over a decade working as an educator, a community organizer, and a researcher in the US and Tanzania. She's also a member of the Sudan Solidarity Collective, which has been supporting local emergency response, known as ERRS, in the face of a largely absent international aid, community, and civilian state. The collective has raised over $300,000 for the ER through political education and has led over 65 teaching games. She has also been organizing around more just Canadian immigration policies. Today, Dr. Elamin will be focusing on the political economy of Sudan's neglected war and will provide context to the current counter-revolutionary war and famine. In particular, she will discuss ongoing struggles over land and the role of civilian volunteers on the front lines of mutual aid and relief efforts. And our very own real Khalid Eltayeb, who is a sophomore here majoring in cybersecurity and engineering, and a co-president of the Sudanese Student Association. Real is, as a co-president of the Sudanese Student Association, helps lead the association's mission to celebrate Sudanese culture, heritage, and identity while fostering a strong sense of community. And Mosaab Baba is the Media Development Director at AbuSulayman, a nonprofit organization focusing on developing media and access to justice in Sudan. Mosaab also serves as the acting director for Al-Alim Network, which has done comprehensive coverage in Sudan since 2013. Mosaab is also a media trainer and a technical consultant who has worked extensively with civil society, media, NGOs, and human rights groups in Africa with a main focus on Sudan. I also just know that Mosaab is an alumni of George Mason University. So today, Mosaab will be speaking about the deadly war in Sudan and the future scenarios. Mosaab, without further ado.
Thank you, Naglaa, and thank you to Nate and the AbuSulayman Center, as well as the SSA. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. It's been a while since I've been at Mason. You know, I was at Mason during the 2000s. That was a time where, you know, there was a Save Darfur and, you know, the CPA, the deal with South Sudan was being put forth on the table. It was active, but it was never this active. You know, Sudan at that time was not in the conversation. So I think the SSA here has a pretty big job ahead of them, and we'll be supporting it, inshallah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the context under which the Sudanese war has happened. And thank God we have Nisrin over here. Nisrin is a comrade from back in the days. And she will give a much better academic analysis of the war in Sudan and why and the intentions behind the war. So hopefully we'll be able to complement each other pretty well. You're going to hear from the angry journalist, and then we're going to bring the academic in to bring some sanity to what's going on. But moving ahead, to understand Sudan, you have to understand the diversity within Africa itself. You know, this is something that's always kind of overlooked. People look, when they mention Africa as being one block. They mention it as being kind of, you know, one national identity for some reason, forgetting that the amount of diversity within Africa is the highest diversity in the world among all the continents. The genetic diversity, the ethno-linguistic diversity, all the levels of diversity within Africa are the highest among the world, and Sudan is no exception to that. If you talk to any Sudanese, naturally you're going to see them speaking in Arabic. Now, not because Arabic is the indigenous language, but because it's the language that now started tying people together, and there's a lot of historical factors to that, religious factors, there are some ethnic factors to it, but the level of diversity even within Sudan itself, 115 languages are spoken inside of Sudan. Different tribes, different regions, different ethno-linguistic groups. I have to be pretty conscious of time, so I can't go into too much into this, but I'll try to kind of just give just a snapshot of how old and diverse the land of Sudan actually is and how that translates to the national identity of Sudan. In order to understand why we got into this war and what were the historical kind of changes, the repressive changes that have kind of taken Sudan to this brink of human suffering, unfortunately. When we look at kind of Sudan and its geographic region, we see that Sudan is, the Nile Valley is kind of like a civilization highway. You know, when we go back and when we look at archaeological evidence, and so we're not talking just about empires and civilizations, we're talking about human evolution as well. And we're talking about early human presence and early human utility. And we see that when the Niles converge from the Blue Nile and the White Nile, and what used to be the Yellow Nile from Lake Chad all the way to northern Sudan, it's almost a natural highway of early human converging and creating civilizations out of that. We could go back as far as the, it might be debated, and we would like to see some healthy academic debate on it, but the whole out of Africa theory, it's not as simple as just going out to Africa and then populating the world. There was a early migration and then reverse migrations. So we say this just to say that the diversity that's developed in Sudan has not only historic elements to it, but it has prehistoric elements to it as well that have to do with geography, that have to do with the rise and fall of empires, and with trade, with religion. Everything that makes Sudan kind of a melting pot for different groups and different civilizations. Now, if we fast forward, we're looking now at 30, 40, 50,000 years ago, when we're looking at these migrations and we're looking at this history of human civilization building. And once we start fast forwarding a couple of thousand years, we start looking at what ties Sudan to the rest of Africa. What ties Sudan to the Middle East? This is where we start to look at kind of now zeroing in and defining kind of the modern day makeup of Sudan. If we look at the Nilo-Saharan groups within Sudan, we're seeing a group of languages and proximity of ethnicities that's going from East Africa and the Rift Valley, all the way through Sudan and southern Sudan and into the Sahel region. This kind of grouping of Nilo-Saharan languages, you start to see a lot of indigenous groups within Sudan that are actually part of this. I mean, all of our families, if we take the SSA one by one, they're going to have some family from one of these indigenous groups, whether it's in northern Sudan, whether it's in Darfur. I mean, I did my DNA test, me and my wife, Buha. We did our DNA test, and it was quite eye-opening as far as different parts of Africa that we have ancestry from. Even though we're both, I think Nisrin is also, like, our family is from a Jazira, from central Sudan, so we didn't expect to have ancestry from the Maasai down in Kenya, or ancestry from the Senegambia, or ancestry from the Amazigh groups in Morocco and Algeria. So it kind of started, it's almost like we started seeing this map in a different light. And the Eastern Sudanic languages, I mean, South Sudan until this day, they it's the closest cultural context to Sudan because of the long history, but because there's also a deeper history of Nilotic languages. There still needs to be a lot of research as to how this map of the Eastern Sudanic languages connects to the kind of older kingdoms, whether it's Kemet, whether it's ancient Egypt, or whether it's Nubia, and starting to see a similarity, and starting to see kind of an older connection between these groups within East Africa and between Sudan. This is just to give a snapshot of how people are connected in the region, Sudan and its neighboring areas. Of course, those who are familiar with Arabic literature, medieval Arabic literature, are familiar with the name Bilad al-Sudan. Bilad al-Sudan, it wasn't just Sudan in its geographic territories today, but it means the entire strip of Africa from the Horn all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Bilad al-Sudan, the land of the blacks. And a lot of people argue that the term black was not really used unless it's within a Western context, but that's actually not true. The term black was actually used to describe the African continent, and as far as a darker people. We can go into older history of the word Egypt, the word Ethiopia, and what it represented during those times. So just to say, to not confine identities and confine within words that have a certain context in different areas. So once you start unpacking it and start zooming out, you're going to see that there's a bigger picture that's been painted over the years. Now, the Afro-Asiatic part of Sudan, and this is kind of where we get two, I don't want to say competing, but two converging identities in Sudan. You have a Nilo-Saharan Sudan that's clearly indigenous in Sudan with a longer history of language and customs that we still use until this day. If you go to Sudanese weddings, you're going to see a lot of customs and stuff that have been handed down over centuries. The gildik and these kind of things have been, part of the Sudanese identity for a very long time. But the Afro-Asiatic identity of Sudan is what also connects it to the different groups within Sudan, whether they're Cushitic groups in the Horn of Africa, whether they are Tawariq or Amazigh groups, or most of Northern Africa as well. And this is not only, like I said, it's a linguistic kind of grouping, but it's also an identity grouping. Like I said, when we do our DNA tests, we're seeing a lot of ancestry from West Africa, from the Sahel region, from North Africa. And this is because of that highway that we spoke about earlier, that is Sudan. And, Sudan being one of the routes towards Hajj in Mecca. So since the 7th century, you've had Sudan as a secondary now highway. The first one was the Nile Valley civilizations, and now there's a second one that has to do with the road to Hajj. And all of West Africa kind of moving either through Egypt or through Sudan to go to Mecca. So that's why over, again, hundreds of years and thousands of years, you started seeing a more mixed diversity and ethnicity within Sudan. And that's how you get this beautiful mosaic of people within Sudan. You have, when you look at the faces, you're starting to see almost this historic, movement of people and nation building and civilization building. And yes, it does come along with wars as well. But in the end, this is what kind of represents Sudan as far as the diversity of its people. Now, when you have this level of diversity in one country, you would expect that the governance of the country to actually reflect that. You would expect that the ruling parties or the caretakers of Sudan to recognize this kind of diversity and to turn it into a strong, multi-ethnic and multicultural country within Africa. And this was actually spoken to by some of the, during the liberation movements within Africa in the 60s. There was this debate of, Sudan was the largest country in Africa at the time, and it should naturally play a leading role on the continent. Unfortunately, that wasn't really the case, where since before independence, there's been a kind of handing off, because a lot of times people start thinking about, well, how did Sudan gain its independence from the British? When you look at the continent, you see a lot of liberation movements that actually freed themselves from the British through armed resistance. So you have the Mau Mau movement in Kenya. You have, even from non-British colonizing forces, like the Frelimo in Mozambique, or the ANC in South Africa, or, you have different armed groups that have risen up. But Sudan didn't go through that. Sudan went through a liberation movement from the Turco-Egyptian rule in the 19th century. But in the 20th century, when the British left, it was more of a handoff, rather than succumbing to a military liberation movement. This created, and because in typical British colonial fashion, divide and conquer. Get a group of elites, give them the power, and let them rule. Hand off the tools of governance and the tools of oppression. This created a lot of discontent within, and it's not only, you see this discontent in other countries. You see this discontent in Kenya, from handing over power to the Kenyatta family, for example. You see it in Egypt, from handing off military power. Then you see resistance in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood and other groups that have been, basically against the idea of this handover of power. So what happened in Sudan? In Sudan, the power was handed off to sects, with religious sects within the northern areas of Sudan to be the elite, being knighted and being given British colonial position. And that automatically created a conflict because it was one ethnic Arab Islamic identity that was given the power. And this led some of the leaders in pre-colonial Sudan to say, colonial Sudan to say that, well, once the British leave, we're going to be an Arab and Islamic country, and we're going to join the Arab League, and that's the end of that whole identity conversation. Of course, naturally, this led the people in South Sudan, who are not Arabs and who are not Muslims, to say automatically that, okay, that means we're going to be second or third class citizens in our own country. If that's the identity of the country and where it's going, that means that we won't have control over our resources around the national identity, language, religion. All of these things will make us into second and third class citizens. And that's why you have rebellion movements like the Anyanya, which picked up arms and said, okay, if you insist on this identity, then we have to break out and become our own country. This, of course, led to some cooler heads prevailing and saying, okay, we're gonna make a peace deal with the Anyanya, and then we're gonna create a secular constitution in 1974 so that all Sudanese of all ethnicities and languages and religions can be included in the country, and so that we can have peace. And there were some years of peace in the 70s, where even when we talk to our older generation, they're like, yes, and things were so nice in the 70s, everybody was cool, things were chill. Unfortunately, Sudan is not an island. And at the time, there was the Red Scare. The fear of the Cold War and Sudan falling into the socialist bloc. You've had already a tug of war between the communists and the monarchy in Ethiopia. You had a lot of Arab nationalists who were more leaning towards the left, whether it's Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and whether it's Gaddafi in Libya. You had, as well, on the continent, you had countries like Uganda that was bordering. You had Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, who was looking for a more sovereign Congo that is staying at the same distance between the East and the West. And unfortunately, he was assassinated. And now we get into where the real problem started happening, which is the insistence of Western policies to include these countries within its fold. So after the 1972 peace agreement, there became a tug of war internally in Sudan between more Pan-African and left forces within the country. You had communists, you had Pan-Africanists, you had a lot of people who were looking at the Western model of capitalism as not being viable for our natural way of life in Sudan, which is it's a communal way of life. We look at the agricultural, and Nisrin will get into that later, but the agricultural way of life has become the way of life that, it has to be translated into some form of governance and planning for the economy. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to zoom a little bit through this, and I think this history is well documented in a lot of places. But you have people like Joseph Lago, who was from the South, who was actually saying that we don't have a problem with Arab and Arab identity and Arabic language and Islam. We don't have a problem with that. We just want a country where we can all feel a belonging and create our alliances, and we actually would create a stronger Sudan. If you allow South Sudan to connect with East Africa, Northern Sudan to connect with North Africa and the Middle East, Western Sudan to connect with the Sahel, it would create an African powerhouse that's based on diversity. Unfortunately, Nimeri then started switching into an Islamist policy. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean like it's a pious Muslim policy. This means that using political Islam. And this means that coercing the public into a fascist government while using religion as the main driver to fuel that fascism. And unfortunately, the ideologue behind this fascism, Turabi, along with Nimeri, came to the US and sat with Reagan and Bush. And Reagan was actually saying that Nimeri is our friend in the area because he is fighting communism. You know, although if you go to Sudan at the time and ask 99% of Sudanese, nobody's not going to know what the hell you're talking about when you talk about communism. So that right there is what puts Sudan in a perpetual cycle of being the front lines for a proxy war between the East and the West, with the Sudanese people kind of being caught in the middle of that. Now, Sharia law was enforced in 1983, and that's when the SPLM North said, okay, we thought we had a peace deal in 1972. Why are you coming back again and declaring Sharia law on the entire country? And now we're back to being second and third class citizens. So the rebellion started. But the important thing to remember is that enforcement of Sharia law and the Islamization of public life and government in Sudan was not done by the Sudanese themselves. They had regional support from Arab and Middle Eastern countries, which we're going to see how that started manifesting later in the war. Now, and this is where there was another nonviolent movement in 1985 that removed Nimeri, and we had elections in 1986, which brought in Sadiq al-Mahdi as the prime minister. But unfortunately, by that time, the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan, the NIF, the National Islamic Front, along with their right-wing, allies around the world, were able to get a hold of the security state, the military, the national security. All of these different entities were now under the strict grip, the iron grip of the National Islamic Front, right? To the point that when, after Bashir took over, Turabi started bringing in Islamist militants from around the world that were against either Arab nationalists or against the monarchies of the Gulf, and started bringing them into Khartoum to actually create a national, a bigger regional Islamic state. ISIS, but a lot more benign and a lot less dangerous than ISIS, and more ideologically based than ISIS. So now you see why there started to be a lot of discontent around the continent, because this is not a problem for the Middle East or a problem for Europe as much as it was a problem for the rest of Africa, looking at it like, this is a hotbed that you're creating right now. Like I said, with a lot of affiliates coming to Khartoum and coming to conferences in Khartoum, even, of course, famously hosting Bin Laden in the 90s, and having him living over there and working on projects and stuff like that. And this was kind of the ideology behind it, of Turabi saying that Sudan is more or less a gateway of Arabic language and Islamism into the rest of Africa. Now, if this was a benign Islamic da'wah, it wouldn't have been a problem, it would have actually been a good thing. But you cannot speak about da'wah when you're backing it up with fascism and dictatorships and ethnic cleansing. The two do not mix at all. And this is kind of what led little by little into creating forcibly bringing Sudan and making it kind of like an outpost of Middle Eastern autocratic systems. And this is where we have to also make a very clear distinction between what these governments have done and between the aspirations of the people in the Middle East and in the Muslim world in general, who have nothing to do with what these corrupt leaders have actually done over the years, and actually do want, and this has been very clear in the Arab Spring, that the entire Middle East wants freedom, justice, and equality, regardless of which country you're talking about. But the levels of power and the power dynamics have turned into a different story. I'll zoom through a little bit, but this is kind of the cost of this insistence of bringing Sudan into the single identity and using this fascism, is that 3 million between South Sudan and the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile have been killed. We were young when this war was happening, but we remember that we had to dodge in Khartoum, we had to dodge the draft trucks that were coming by and asking you, like, hey, are you a student or are you an employee? Neither? All right, get in. We're going to go and make Sudan great again. You know, it was that kind of war and that kind of, propaganda that pushed people towards that war. It's kind of what led little by little to the uprising in 2018, which Nisrin will talk about a little bit and get more into those dynamics and why the war right now is going there. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time, so I'm just zooming a little bit through these slides. By 2018, right before the uprising, this is the political breakdown that we had in Sudan, which is very confusing, and don't worry, I'm not going to go into details and explain which political force is which. Jean-Baptiste Galopin, he did this, which is pretty accurate as far as a snapshot of what was the political landscape looking like before the December 2018 uprising. And just a quick timeline of how that happened or what happened since that time. We have the protest starting in December 2018. Bashir being removed in 2019 was an accumulation of people who were against the policies that I was just describing and the kind of devastating results of it. This is the first time since independence that there was a national consensus around the fact that the more the Bashir regime remains, the more that the country is gonna be sold off, inch by inch, and more repression, because the tools of oppression themselves have started, developing and evolving recently. Okay, I have 30 seconds left. And we're not halfway through, so apologies for not doing this in a timely manner. But now the war, what we have to remember about this war is that if you're the NCP and you want to come back into power, and you know Bashir has been removed in 2019 with a national consensus that they don't want him or his government back again, then the only way that you could come back to power is if you instigate a war. Knowing that you have an out of control entity as the RSF, which is the Rapid Support Forces, that has been nurtured and grown by the Bashir regime to quell its opposition, and now it's been unleashed on the rest of the country. So, the red is where the army controlled, the yellow is where the RSF was controlling in the beginning of the war. The green areas are areas of liberation movements that looked at what happened in 2019 and said we're not going to be a part of this because we still don't agree on how to govern Sudan and who's part of Sudan and who's not. Now, these are, when we start looking, I'm just going to take 5 more minutes. When we start looking at who's backing the war in Sudan and who's backing the different military outfits that are at war right now, of course we have the countries that have been now taking to becoming more or less the caretakers of Sudan's security sector since 2014. Bashir divorced Iran and Turkey and some of the countries that are supporting political Islam, and then went into the bosom of the Gulf nations that are now have more or less control over not only the security sector, but the economic sector as well. Monopolization of entire economic sectors, which Nisrin will get into soon. It's not a coincidence that most of these are US allies with US military presence within these countries. What's scarier than that is this map right here. Why would Benjamin Netanyahu put up a map that understandably would include the countries that he wants to normalize with within the Middle East, but why would he include Sudan in that map? So once again, just like the 70s, Sudan is now being pushed into a proxy war that's way bigger than the actual borders of Sudan, and the Sudanese people are paying the price for this again. Now the Sudanese people are paying the price because of what these same military leaders that are at war right now try to do, and try to use the Sudanese people as bargaining chips within their chessboard in the Middle East. Now, when we say that it's a neo-colonial order, it's because if other countries have the upper hand and influence with your entire military apparatus, and now your resources, the amount of gold that has been taken into the UAE, and from the poorest areas in Sudan that happen to be mining areas, is what basically broke the Sudanese economy and turned it into a militia economy, basically. When you have somebody exporting $16 billion to the UAE, that's 1/4 of Sudan's entire national debt. So it was clear that you cannot have two armies in the same country that control the entire economy of the country and create that catch-22 where they're selling off resources to feed their military and their militias, right? Unfortunately, this is not only in Sudan. Now, when you see the Sahel countries removing themselves from the ECOWAS and creating the Sahel Alliance, is because they've been suffering of the same problem that Sudan has been suffering, of warlords and militias extracting resources and crushing any civilians along the way. And this is going into Chad, into Niger, into Mali, into Burkina Faso, all the way out to Mauritania. Some countries within this region are able to deal with it and able to contain it, and some are not able to contain it, like the situation in Sudan. But this is the true cost of what's going on right now. When we say that the Sudanese people are paying the price for this, it's because these maps are showing exactly how many people are affected by these wars. And these are the areas that are at risk of famine right now as we speak. Yet we don't see any talk of this within the media, within the mainstream media, or within the alternative media, or take your pick of which media that is not speaking about this issue in Sudan. And this is the map as it stands today, with the RSF now expanding into areas like Jazeera and into White Nile and Sinai, and moving into these areas because the army has abandoned these people in these areas and led them to this out-of-control militia that's been repressing people for such a long time. And now this is in the past 2 weeks, 134,000 people being removed, being displaced from a Jazeera state, which just happens to be our home state as well. Now, real quick, I'm going to wrap up just to talk about the future scenarios. The Syria scenario, unfortunately, it seems like the most realistic scenario right now that's happening as things stand, where you're going to have militias and militaries vying for resources and working with foreign interests on this, and for it to drag on for years and years. The Libya scenario is another scenario that can happen, where the RSF creates its own government, and now SAF is creating its own government, and as long as they're getting resources and extracting these resources, they'll be happy to keep those lines together. A military caretaker government, they could put down their arms and agree bilaterally between the SAF and RSF and create a new military government in order to still control the resources in the country and repress any idea of any kind of civilian government. there could be a power sharing deal where the political forces would be able to convince SAF and RSF to create a power sharing deal where they share power, but again, the fundamental issues of reform within the security sector or within the economic sector are not addressed. So it's just going to be kicking that can down the road a little bit more and expecting a more delayed war. There are some peace scenarios that a lot of us are working day and night over in order to try and have the kind of collective wisdom take over rather than this insanity that's been going on over the decades. First of all, I have to be very clear about this, that Sudan is an African country. The Arab identity is part of that African tapestry, and Sudan has to have a Pan-African discourse when it comes to governance, when it comes to managing public affairs, when it comes to its external relationships, when it comes to its trade relationships. Everything has to be within its natural African habitat, rather than trying to force Sudan into an exclusively Middle Eastern country. The African Union has to be pushed and has to address the issue in Sudan. The African Union, of course, has tremendous problems because of the states within the African Union and how much infighting there is as well over there. And we see the kind of tension and the escalation that's happening right now between Egypt and Ethiopia and Somalia and everything. And unfortunately, Sudan is in a neighborhood that's also unstable. But this has to prompt the African Union and the local African bodies to actually take the lead on this. And we don't need UN forces to come in. We definitely don't need US forces to come in. We need Western countries to support the African Union into having a comprehensive solution for Sudan. The protection of civilians is kind of what we are, a lot of us who are working on Sudan and activists are pushing for right now, because the entire effort of bringing peace in Sudan has been focused on bringing Hemeti and Burhan in the same room and having them shake hands and sit down. And that clearly is not going to happen. So the idea of protection of civilians has to be also a homegrown formula for protecting civilians, protecting farmlands, protecting trade routes, and protecting, most important of all, the humanitarian aid and the routes for humanitarian aid that should be coming into Sudan. And there has to be a national mechanism for truth and reconciliation. All of the peace deals that have happened in Sudan have been power sharing deals. And what about the victims of the wars, of the ethnic cleansings that have happened? It's always been swept under the rug in the name of security and peace, and then it's a power sharing, and none of the grievances of the historic or the recent grievances actually get addressed. So a national truth and reconciliation commission has to be the adhesive that holds together prosperous and a peaceful Sudan. I apologize if the grim, the situation that I painted is a little bit grim, but I would be happy to discuss it and answer any questions. So thank you for your time, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Mosaab. That was eye-opening. Thank you so much. And now, Dr. Nisrin Elamin.
It's a very hard act to follow, especially for someone who said that they weren't going to offer us, academic analysis or, it was great. So some of what I say might be repetition, but I don't think that's necessarily bad. So first, I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here, for the center for inviting me, for Naglaa and Matt for reaching out to me. So what I'm going to try to do today is to kind of situate this war. Well, let me start by saying when the war erupted, right? Since the war has erupted, it's triggered the world's largest displacement crisis, right? 14 million people have been displaced by this war. And the kind of very scant international media coverage of the ongoing war has largely failed to capture the socio-political dynamics and historical roots that frame it. And I think that framing is actually very important in this moment. If we don't understand, what this war is about, then we can't actually figure out how to get, to the other side of it. Okay. So I've divided this talk into several sections: history, revolution, counter-revolution, and life. And instead of giving you a comprehensive historical overview of the roots of the current war in Sudan, I'm actually going to link a rather obscure historical anecdote to the outbreak of the first civil war in Sudan in 1955, the year before independence, to kind of situate it within a long history of state violence and to nuance the center-periphery framework that shapes it. And I'm going to start with history. I want to time myself so I'm not sure it's over, because we academics can talk even longer than academics. And so I'm not a historian. I'm trained as an anthropologist, and that means that you shouldn't trust anything I say. But Sudan has had a long history of popular resistance against the state. This historiography of resistance tends to center around urban revolutions which overthrew military dictators. Sudan's December Revolution is often compared to its 1964 revolution. Right, the 1964 revolution, sparked by clashes between students convening a symposium on the question of South Sudanese autonomy and police at the University of Khartoum that toppled Aboud's military regime, or to the 1985 Intifada, triggered by US and IMF recommended austerity measures that overthrew Numeri's dictatorship. But today I'd like to trace the genealogy of the December Revolution back to the 1950s to demonstrate that the demands made of the Sudanese state and the challenges brought to its very legitimacy as it was forming are still very relevant today. So Britain's parting gift to Sudan at independence in 1956 was an economy dependent on the extraction of cash crops like cotton, and a political system which was reconfigured to serve the interests of a very narrow northern and central Sudanese, Nubian and Arab identified elite. And both systems developed at the expense of the masses in the south and other marginalized regions, but also of a rural population at the center who helped to sustain this extractive, export-oriented economy. As an example, the British vacated 800 administrative seats, meaning civil servants, agricultural scheme managers, top army and police officials, etc., right before independence across the country, of which Sudan's new ruling elite allocated 6 to South Sudan, an area the size of Texas with a population of over 2.5 million at the time. The remaining 790 plus seats were primarily occupied by elites from the north and center, and as such this Sudanization process, which is what it was called by the British, facilitated and enshrined the ongoing systemic marginalization of other regions such as Darfur, Eastern Sudan, Kordofan, and the Blue Nile region. Some of the initial forms of resistance against the new post-colonial state came unsurprisingly from tenant farmers who organized to demand, among other things, a greater share of profits as world cotton prices plummeted. A strike took place on a cotton scheme near Kosti shortly after independence. The state responded with extreme violence. Over 300 striking tenant farmers were shot on the fields or suffocated in overcrowded, poorly ventilated detention cells. A year earlier, Sudan's first civil war had broken out between southern Sudanese demanding political representation, equitable resource distribution and regional autonomy, and the central government, for some of the reasons that Mosaab laid out very, very, very well, who had essentially subsumed the South as a quasi-internal colony. In August of 1955, South Sudanese members of the British-administered Sudan Defense Forces Equatorial Corps mutinied in the southern town of Torit. The mutiny was partly inspired by the Sudanization process, which I described, led by northern elites, but also by their repressive, so the northern elites' repressive response to a labor protest following the abrupt dismissal of 300 southern workers from a textile factory in a southern town called Nazara, during which 14 protesters were killed by the army. While the mutiny was brutally squashed, it laid the ground for Southerners to take up arms against the central government. And if you want to learn more about this time period, I think it's a very important time for us to know about, read historian Skopas Pogo's work. You can look here at his one of the books. And if you look, I mean, I was reading this actually last night, and if you look at what the RSF is doing right now in the Jazeera and in Darfur, the same tactics that were used by the army in the aftermath of the Tawreed Mutiny, right? Sexual violence as a weapon of war, starvation as a weapon of war, right? Forced displacement and burning of villages. It happened in 1955 as well, right? And if we don't understand that history, we're never going to actually break that cycle, okay? So now this 1956 massacre on the Joda pumping scheme near Kosti is linked to the outbreak of the First Civil War in my mind, because striking farmers in Sudan Center were threatening existing capitalist labor relations that allowed ruling elites to extract maximum profits to fund its repressive campaign against resistance, right? Against southern resistance fighters in this case. And I highlight this historical moment because it reveals the way state violence in Sudan has long been shaped by the need to reproduce and maintain an extractive war economy that serves elite interests by any means necessary. We can draw a straight line from the outbreak of the Civil War in 1955, which over the decades in its two phases killed over 2.5 million mostly South Sudanese people, partly because of famine, right, and the healthcare system collapsing, etc., not only, of course, bullets, to the current war that arrived in Khartoum on April 15th of 2023. In the same way, I would argue that you can draw a straight line between the Nakba of 1948 to the genocidal violence the Israeli state is currently unleashing in Gaza. History is not only context here, it is the necessary framework of analysis for understanding the roots of violence in and beyond Sudan. And this framework forces us to not exceptionalize the violence currently engulfing parts of the country in unprecedented ways, like the Jazeera, for example, but to situate it within a longer history of violence that underpins the country's economic and political system of elite rule. And so since the 1950s, and certainly under the Numerian and Bashir regime, as Mosaab was just pointing out, we saw this need to serve Sudanese elite interests by any means necessary manifest itself in the form of an ethno-nationalist, racist, monocultural, right-wing religious project, right? Being imposed on a multiracial, multilingual, multi-religious country in violent ways. We saw this play itself out in Darfur, where a state-sanctioned campaign of genocidal violence led by the Janjaweed, now known as the Rapid Support Forces, was carried out beginning in 2003. Killing hundreds of thousands, wiping out entire villages of non-Arab farming communities, and displacing millions of Sudanese civilians from resource-rich land which continues to be exploited to fuel the current war. And I want to just make a point here. I think as we understand racialized violence in Sudan, we have to connect it to, in my mind, a framework of racial capitalism, right? Where this violence allows for the continued extraction of resources. I think the two frameworks are important in kind of understanding what's happening in Sudan. And it is this project and the violent, extractive, militarized state that imposed it that the most radical elements of the revolution set out to dismantle in 2018, 2019. And I just want to mention that all forms of dissent and organized resistance against this ideological project and state repression more broadly, and there have been many over the decades. You know, I don't want to kind of gloss over that. Many people have resisted the state in the center, in the peripheries, etc., in different ways. The response to them has been different based on who they are, right? But that resistance has been brutally suppressed through an ever-expanding security apparatus of law enforcement bodies, paramilitary forces, torture houses, prisons, and surveillance tactics. The violence of this project, however, cannot solely be pinned on Sudanese state and business elite. It required buy-in from ordinary people as well, who oiled the racist propaganda machine that legitimized and facilitated it. Some of you might remember, if you're old enough, in 2003, you talked to any of your older relatives about how things were talked about at that time, right? There was a kind of denial of what was happening in the region, and I think it's important for us to kind of grapple with that. Thousands of people, for example, were absorbed into the security state as the regime's foot soldiers. Darfurians getting recruited as frontline soldiers to fight in the war against South Sudanese rebels through the Popular Defense Forces, one of the primary instruments of Islamist political and popular mobilization, and dispossessed farmers and herders in central Sudan getting absorbed into the lower ranks of the infamous NIS, National Intelligence and Security Services, known for its raids and violent crackdowns on protest dissidents, civil society activists, and journalists, are just two examples of how ordinary Sudanese, many themselves neglected and marginalized by the state, became agents of its repressive counterinsurgency. Okay, everybody still with me? In April of 2019, a popular revolution ousted Omar al-Bashir after 30 years in power, after converging, and I should just mention, I think another thread, I could have traced us all the way back to the 19th century. The 19th century is very important in understanding what is currently happening in Sudan, and I think particularly the kind of Turco-Egyptian rule, the Ottoman Empire, and the ways that slavery expanded during that time and was connected to a kind of burgeoning plantation economy. And you can read here Ahmed Sigaida's work and Ibrahim Boud's work, right? Okay, so this is the revolution. We saw rural and urban demands for land reform and economic justice at the center converge with decade-old struggles for justice and self-determination in Sudan's so-called peripheries. In December of 2018, protests emerged in towns like Atbara, a town known for its railroad worker organizing, Mayirnu and Damazin, before converging into some kind of fatally centralizing in front of the military headquarters in the capital. After al-Bashir's ouster, the sit-in remained in place for 3 months because people's demands exceeded calls for regime change and because military elites from within al-Bashir's inner circle had reclaimed power, the Transitional Military Council. The backbone of the revolution consisted of neighborhood resistance committees, or I'm going to call them RCs, of which there are, before the war, there are close to 8,000 across the country. But also independent farmer and labor unions, professional associations, feminist youth and student formations, the kind of grassroots civil society that has mostly but not entirely resisted NGOization and formal opposition party politics. The resistance committees are neighborhood-based, consensus-based collectives that have been operating in the absence of a civilian-led state for the last decade. They developed in direct opposition to the popular committees established by the former regime through which the state infiltrated and extended its reach to the neighborhood level. They have coordinating committees at various city, district, and state levels to which they elect representatives. Most emerged in 2013 during anti-government protests, but not all. I mean, a lot of them also emerged during the revolution, triggered by IMF-recommended austerity measures. Beyond coordinating these protests, they have organized around restoring access to water and other basic services. Under the umbrella of mutual aid or Nafir, they served as an organizing vehicle for flood relief efforts, COVID prevention, playground cleanups, school and mosque repair projects, and mobilized against government land grabs. And this mutual aid work, I think, really served to draw ordinary people who are averse to or disillusioned by politics into kind of more political organizing later on. Labor activist Rabab al-Naim points out that it is not useful to study these committees as a unifying structure because the resistance committee is a reflection of the political and social class behind it. And their politics, of course, differ across class, region, etc. They've had to contend with a lot of internal fragmentation and contradictions, but most have adopted a politic that is critical of the violent, extractive, and ethno-nationalist character of the state. And while they do not represent a unified structure, they are, I think, a powerful revolutionary political force and emerge clearly as such during the transitional period and after the October 2021 coup, when some of the committees located in the peripheries began drafting revolutionary political charters. And these charters lay out important analysis, which helps us situate the current war and famine within this kind of longer history of militarized state violence, but also within a kind of decimation of rural livelihoods through neoliberal processes of austerity and privatization that really got ramped up during the transition. After the coup, during al-Bashir's rule, The Revolutionary Charter for Establishing People's Power offers us a model of what a popular democracy from the bottom up looks like. It proposes a decentralized governing structure that implies the dismantling of the militarized Sudanese state in its current formation. Organized Abdel Salim bin Das describes it as a process of occupying the institutions of power from the bottom levels to the top by localizing, democratizing, and diffusing this power through local and state councils, executive and judicial structures. And it is this disorganization and inversion of centralized elite power and violence that is perhaps why the committees and the Sudanese revolution more broadly captured people's imagination around the world. It is also, I think, why the current war in Sudan can be understood as part of the counter-revolution that metastasizes and emerges simultaneously as the revolution evolves and adapts to the kind of pendulum swing towards populist fascism, which brings me to the counter-revolution. In June of 2019, after an RSF-led massacre broke up the sit-in, so you see images of the sit-in, resistance committee. This is the charter that I was talking about. Right, we saw after the sit-in was broken up, we saw the resistance committees and the more radical elements of the revolution sidelined during the formation of a transitional government in favor of civilian elites. Many from the diaspora, who attempted to open Sudan up after decades of isolation through the Clinton-era sanctions, right, this is from the 90s, at least the sanction regime existed, to international donor funding. Those civilian elites turned outward during the transition, adopting neoliberal reforms rather than remaining inwardly focused on demands emerging from the streets. An example of this is, I think, the Abrams Accord, a normalization with Israel agreement, which was signed during the transition following Bahrain and Morocco, in exchange for being dropped from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism and the promise of over $1 billion in annual financing from the World Bank, amidst opposition from the public, right? After the October 2021 coup, we saw UN peace talks led by the US, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the UK legitimize and prop up the coup leaders, Burhan and Hemeti, both responsible for war crimes that span decades, right? And these talks framed these two generals as potential reformists rather than heeding the call of the resistance committees, which called for no negotiations, no legitimacy, and no partnership with the military. And this lack of accountability and international diplomacy as a tool of empire, prioritizing stability over revolutionary demands, is partly, in my view, what paved the way for this war. As civilian and military elites attempted to negotiate a power-sharing agreement behind closed doors after the coup, the resistance committees and other formations continued to fill the void created by the largely absent service-providing wing of the state. They monitored the distribution of fuel to petrol stations to avoid price gauging and shortages. They delivered bread and cooking gas cylinders to houses in their neighborhood. In Al-Rahad, North Kordofan, the resistance committees broke down government-run zakat stores, took out grain, and redistributed it. In other areas, they formed sliding-scale food markets. Workers across different sectors organized some of the longest labor strikes in Sudanese history during this time, demanding better wages and working conditions and challenging the use of harmful chemicals in the agribusiness and mining sector. When the current war erupted in April of 2023, the military coup regime imploded and split, with each military faction vying not only for political but also economic control of the country. The trigger for this war is often reduced to a disagreement, an internal power struggle over security sector reform, but obviously, as we've learned from Mosaab today as well, its root causes are far more structural and historical. On one hand, we have the RSF, formerly known as the Janjaweed, led by General Hemeti and his allied militias, whose leaders control much of the livestock and illicit gold trade in the country. Sudan is Africa's third largest producer of gold, and the UAE, its main gold trading partner, is now providing critical military support to the RSF as it extracts Sudanese gold. This gold gets funneled, smuggled out from Darfur through Chad and Central African Republic and other countries to the gold markets of the UAE, and then sold to Russia and other countries. Were the UAE to cut its funding lifeline to the RSF, the conditions on the ground would change significantly. On the other hand, we have the Sudanese armed forces and its allied Islamists, led by General Burhan, who control large sectors of Sudan's economy, close to 200 companies in rubber, livestock, wheat, cement, real estate, gum arabic, pharmaceuticals, and construction, some of which are in turn backed by Gulf financing. Egypt provides a critical support to the army, partly in an effort to protect its interests with regards to the Red Sea and the Nile River basin, particularly in relation to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, but there are also other reasons which we can talk about later. Evidence suggests that Ukraine, Iran, Qatar, and Turkey have started supporting the army, presumably in an attempt to challenge the power and wealth Russia and the UAE respectively are accumulating through this war. In 2013, the Janjaweed were turned into the RSF by al-Bashir as part of a coup-proofing strategy against the army. Thank you. They were also legitimized by something called the Khartoum process in 2014, a process through which the European Union is attempting to externalize its border to the region between Sudan and Libya. At the time, it funneled $200 million to the RSF through the former regime to militarize this border in order to stem the migration of East Africans into Europe. the RSF and the army have both sent troops to fight in Yemen on the Saudi coalition's behalf, thereby expanding their transnational networks. In my own research, I look at the approximately $27 billion investments the Saudi and Emiratis have made in Sudanese land and infrastructure over the last 20 years. And I document the many forms of popular resistance that they've inspired. In the early 2000s, the Bashir regime began implementing neoliberal policies to privatize the rural sector. In the Jazeera in particular, it was facilitated by a law that was passed in 2005. And they basically started withdrawing state extension services and inputs from small farmers in order to attract foreign and domestic investments in land. And this was partly to make up for losses in oil revenue, 75%, that would accompany South Sudan's likely independence in 2011, which obviously became independent after that. But this was in anticipation of that. In the agricultural Jazeera region, as I mentioned, this was facilitated by the 2005 law, which decimated the small-scale agricultural sector, forcing small farmers into debt to pave the way for these land deals. And I should say it was also domestic investors who got attracted to this, right? People like Mosaab, for example. And these land grabs, if you will, have restructured Sudan's agricultural economy and decimated the kind of cottage dairy industry that a lot of herding communities rely on, right? In particular, and it's made rural communities much more dependent on food imports from other regions and countries, making people much more vulnerable to food insecurity. Now, why is that? A lot of these farms are not growing food. They're growing water-intensive alfalfa and other kinds of animal feed that is exported to the Gulf to dairy farms, right, for dairy production, meat production, etc. And these same dairy and meat products have in turn returned to Sudan and flooded rural markets, right? And in particular, decimated local small-scale dairy production. I don't know if any of you, when you go to Sudan, when you've been to Sudan, go to the rural stores, you'll have noticed that over the past 10 years or so, there are more and more refrigerated dairy products that are pasteurized. Again, Osama Dawood was one of them, right? But there's much more that, in essence, what those companies were trying to do is to put the donkey man who brings the milk to you, right, out of business. That was really the idea behind it, right? And they really kind of, to some degree, they succeeded, right? It is among dispossessed pastoralists who used to produce milk that the RSF, who are now along with the army, Sudan's biggest employers, have found some of their most willing recruits. So instead of looking at these Gulf investments purely through the lens of food security, I think we should understand them as part of a strategy to control circuits, networks, and nodes of distribution and production across the Horn of Africa. And I kind of want to show you this. Okay, so here you see the UAE, the UAE's kind of attempts, and some of them successful, to kind of build this network of ports across the... And so what happens with ports? You can control what comes in and out of the country, right? You can control these kind of networks and nodes of distribution and production. In 2002, there was a $6 billion port deal that the Emiratis signed that was north of Port Sudan, right? Purposefully so, because people had been trying to privatize the port in Port Sudan unsuccessfully because of organizing and resistance, and then just took... So the Emiratis, learning from that, decided to pitch a project further north, about 200 kilometers north. The deal was, of course, upended by the war. I just heard that I think the army kind of canceled it. But I think it represents the UAE's attempt to undermine Sudan's national port and to benefit from Sudan's strategic location along the Red Sea as it kind of expands its power across the Horn. A process which is necessarily counter-revolutionary, requiring stable authoritarian elite rule. Okay? And so here what I've tried to do is I've tried to lay out some of the fragments of a much more complex political economy in Sudan's war, which have compelled Sarah Abbas, Rawab al-Naim, and Abdul Rauf Umar and I to frame this war. I think that the proxy war framing is a compelling one, but I will just say that for us, I think this is more of a multi-scale or internationalized counter-revolutionary war that is meant to serve and protect the interests of Sudanese elites and their international partners, and to preserve the Sudanese state kind of in its current formation, right? And again, I think I find the proxy war, while I find it compelling, I think the proxy war framing can tend to obscure the role that Sudanese state and business elites have played for decades now and laying the foundation upon which this war is being fought. So we've already talked about the fact that now Sudan's population of 48 million is caught in the middle of the senseless war. While its 7 borders remain very difficult to reach and cross, people have resorted to paying smugglers over $1,000 to cross into Egypt, for instance, often risking imprisonment and deportation in the process. Half of Sudan's population, or over half, is now in dire need of food aid in a country that could easily feed itself in the region. Right? Only 26% of the estimated 4 billion needed to launch an adequate response effort, and there might have been updates to this number, has actually been received by the international community, and both parties have obstructed the entry of international aid. 19 million children are out of school, the healthcare system has largely collapsed. I've mentioned the displacement crisis. Many countries, now despite Sudan constituting the largest displacement crisis in the world, with over now 30% of the population displaced, there is no country, at least that I know of, that has issued expedited free special visas for Sudanese refugees. Right? It's about high time that something like that happens. Many countries, including the governments of Tunisia and Egypt, and the UK, have begun deporting Sudanese citizens, in some cases, in North Africa at least, through funding from the European Union. The death toll is estimated to be somewhere around 150,000, but the exact number is really difficult to document and track, particularly amidst nationwide internet and phone service blackouts and sort of repeated attacks on journalists. Right? Since the war began, and I don't want to go over time here, sorry, the RSF has terrorized civilians by occupying and looting their homes, used sexual violence as a weapon of war, and civilians as human shields against the aerial attacks of the army. The UN estimates that 6.7 million people are at risk of gender-based violence, perpetrated primarily by the RSF, but also by other armed actors. In Darfur and the Nuba Mountains, they have reactivated kind of ethnic cleansing campaigns that long predate this war. In farming areas, they've destroyed key agricultural infrastructures and production sites, looted farms and grain storage facilities, and attacked farmers attempting to plant. Since October, they have been committing massacres in farming villages across the agricultural region of central Sudan, causing a mass exodus from the region. And we can talk about why this might be happening, right? But they have looted tens of thousands also of some of the oldest and archaeologically most important artifacts in the world from Sudan's national museums and heritage sites, including some that date back to 2500 BC. The army, on the other hand, has failed to evacuate or protect people and has bombed civilian areas, including hospitals and homes, killing civilians in the process. And I know this is always a controversial point when they start to bring up the army's role here. It has also repeatedly denied that famine exists in parts of the country, despite ample evidence to the contrary. In August of 2024, the army bombed an IDP camp on the outskirts of Al-Fashir in North Darfur, where 38% of children suffer from acute malnutrition, in an attempt to eliminate the evidence for famine. Contrary to some analysis that frame the RSF as a non-state entity and militia gone rogue, the RSF and the Sudanese army are part of the same state apparatus that grabbed power in the 2021 coup, upending a process that was meant to lead Sudan towards democratic elections. Which brings me to my final point, life, and I'm almost done. In the midst of this brutal war, emergency response groups have emerged across the country, some modeled after resistance committees and some led by some of its members, right? Rooted again in neighborhoods. In the face of a barely present international aid community, they are leading food and medicine distribution efforts, organizing communal kitchens, driving ambulances, coordinating evacuation and protection activities, setting up ad hoc emergency clinics, rape crisis centers and women response rooms, converting defunct schools into shelters, repairing and restoring public services such as water and electricity, retrieving and burying dead bodies, liaising with store owners and pharmacists to source food and medicines, and running things like urban gardening projects and initiatives for displaced children. Right? In Khartoum, and these are old numbers, but there were 69 of these emergency response rooms across 7 districts, coordinated by over 1,400 volunteers. In Darfur, there were over 89 of them coordinated across 5 states. Many have had to shut down over the last few months due to lack of funding, violence, and targeted attacks on volunteers. Though very much intergenerational, many are led by young people whose education was interrupted by this war, some of whom have chosen to stay in war zones while their relatives have evacuated to safer towns. So I'm almost at the end here, but I'd like you to actually take out your phones and to go to sudansolidarity.com, or at least note it down somewhere, make mental notes. I want to ask you to please consider becoming a $5, $10, or $25 monthly donor if you can. No amount is too small. As a collective, we've raised actually now $400,000 for them and other kind of mutual aid networks, and the vast majority comes from small donors like yourselves, right? Your monthly support allows us to sustain this work and to remain independent as well. The Sudanese diaspora and their non-Sudanese allies, meaning you, can play a critical role in helping these mutual aid networks preserve their independence by providing sustained material support with no strings attached. I think this is very important because there will always be attempts to co-opt and to, with that funding come strings attached, right? So yeah, I'm going to probably end here. I just want to, I'll end with this. In a nation on no map, my friend William C. Anderson writes, quote, "Simply detaching ourselves from the state is not enough. We're charged with growing our own survival programs, institutions, and survival economies as a means of building a revolutionary movement that can effectively challenge the state. We'll have to be able to present masses of people with revolutionary options that can actually meet day-to-day needs like food, housing, and healthcare." A quote that seems very relevant today in the immediate aftermath of this US election, right? And I just want to say, I think while the ERs are generally seen as kind of non-political volunteerism, right, form of volunteerism, I do think that there is a kind of political potential behind them. They're certainly at the forefront of what's happening. They should be included in some of these higher, at least consulted, right, in terms of what the vision is to get out of this war. And I will say that I think, they're meeting the day-to-day needs of hundreds of thousands in the midst of this brutal war, despite massive inflation and food shortages. They're insisting on staying put, on living and on sustaining each other to live amidst the threat of death, sexual violence, and torture. And again, this is not just the ERRs, but all other mutual aid networks across the country. While the needs are far greater than they can fulfill, it is thanks to them that many of our loved ones are surviving this war. I have not heard that these volunteers articulated anarchist politics or desired per se to replace the state, but I think that their labor constitutes a form of revolt that we have yet to discern and name, and that at the very least deserves recognition as a form of resistance against the militarized states and the many forms of violence it produces. Thank you for listening.
I couldn't help myself from reading everything that you said. Thank you so much. And now, Eltayeb from the Sudanese Student Association here at George Mason.
So, hello everyone. My name is Eltayeb, and I'm the co-president of the Sudanese Student Association here at Mason. So, as Sudanese students here at Mason, we've been carrying the weight of everything happening back home. And it's been hard on, I'm pretty sure, all of us. It's been 5 years since the revolution started. And since then, we've lost a lot of brothers and sisters. And with the civil war that erupted last year, that sense of loss has only deepened. A lot of us feel helpless. It's like we're all tied up, but too far away to do what we really wish we could. But we're all trying to support in whatever ways we can, whether financially or by spreading awareness. But honestly, it often feels like it's not enough, although it's the right step and the right direction. And this is exactly why we're here. This is exactly why we have the Sudanese Student Association at Mason. We're a big community, and we need each other to provide that sense of home and connection. Even if it's just a little bit. SSA is here to help its students academically, emotionally, and culturally. With events like the Machai to take us back to Shara Anil, to our soccer games that take us back to Hilal versus Madrid games, and the uncles getting a little too competitive, and to our diptychs, where we learn more about our beautiful Sudanese weddings, from henna to al-himma. Our mission is really about celebrating Sudanese culture, heritage, and identity. We want to be a source of empowerment for the community, not just here at Mason, but throughout the Nova area, through cultural exchanges, academic support, and incentives that raise awareness. We're trying to make a lasting positive impact, and in this way, we're honoring our roots, and we're supporting one another, and staying connected to something bigger, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you for our speakers. Thank you, Dr. Nisrin Elamin, Mosaab, and Rio. Thank you so much